welcome to the show. And we're going to get started right away with our guest today, Kaedrich Olsen, who's going to share all about the paranormal Norse teachings. And it's going to be a very interesting episode. So stick around and listen in. Here we go. Well, hello, Kaedrich. Thank you so much for being here today and joining me on the show. It's great to have you here.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to give you the real formal super intro, but I'm going to let you do that yourself and explain it a little bit yourself of what your journey is, who you are. We'll start with who you are.
Who I am. I'm a shadow worker and a paranormal trainer who's well steeped in the Norse tradition. I wish I could give a simple answer, but there never is one. I basically help people learn to coexist with the paranormal, to relieve any paranormal problems, make connections with the other side, develop your subtle abilities, your paranormal abilities, as well as work on the deeper, darker parts of the inner world, the shadow world, the things that annoy us, the things that bug us, maybe lingering trauma that we've carried with us over the years, especially if it's related to paranormal and spiritual matters, to clearing that out. And I've been working with the Norse tradition practically my whole life anyway. And so it's not that I teach the Norse stuff or anything overtly, but it's something that tends to get infused, like learning about the runes and how to bring runes into certain things or how to connect with ancestors in kind of a Norse way. So the Norse tends to be a little bit infused rather than overtly taught. But that's kind of who I am these days, just sort of like a paranormal trainer, shadow worker.
Beautiful. Yeah, I know. In the most simplistic form, I think you did a beautiful job there.
Thank you. Thank you.
And tell us a little bit, for those that don't know, like what is Norse and what are runes?
Absolutely. The Norse tradition comes to us from Scandinavia, pre-Christian Scandinavia areas and the Germanic area. So if you've heard names like Odin and Thor, not like the Marvel movies, but if you heard the names like Odin and Thor, which of course you have because, Tuesday is Tyr's Day, one of the Norse gods. Wednesday is Odin's Day, Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day, Friday, Freya's Day. So you've heard of the Norse gods, even if you weren't aware of it. And you're more familiar with runes than you think you are,
Mm,
because runes are the written form of the Proto-Norse and the Old Norse languages, the languages that evolved into modern day Swedish, German, and English, among
mm,
among others. And so when you look at letters like F, S, T, B, I, C, those come to us directly from the runes. They look the same, they have the same pronunciation, and if you were to look at a runestone carved 1,000 years ago with words like father, mother, sister, brother, you would be able to read those words with no problem. I wouldn't even need to help you there because they were written almost the exact same way as they are today and pronounced the same way as they were 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. But runes have a sacred side to them. They're all ideograms, meaning each rune has an energy, has a meaning to it. And that meaning can be very relevant, such as Fehu. The rune, it looks like the letter F. It is where we get the letter F from, the F sound. In the Proto-Norse language, Fehu meant cattle because cattle was a means of wealth, a means of abundance. At that time period, it was an agrarian culture. So farming was the pinnacle of society. And so the more cattle you had, the more livestock you had, the richer you were.
mm,
Eventually, the word fey evolved into the English word of fee, where we're still talking about money, we're still talking about value. So when we look at Fehu, it's all about the time, effort, energy, the investment that you're putting in, the capital you're putting in. So it can mean money, but it could also mean the effort that you're taking to the investment of your time. So think of Fehu as like value. And so if you were to like buy like this crystal, its initial value is what you pay for it. That's its Fehu. But over time, as you start to use the crystal and it has a meaning to you and it has a different intrinsic value, it has a different Fehu. And
mm,
the way I work with runes with people, for example, is what is your Fehu around you? What do you see as the value of things around you? Not just the monetary, but the intrinsic value. What is the Fehu of things around you? And once you get familiar with that, take a look inside. What is your Fehu? How do you see yourself? What is your value? What are your values? What are you valuable at? And if you don't like that answer, you can shift it because that's the nature of runic energy. You can shift that. You start to see your Fehu as a higher value, take stock of the things that you were successful at, the accomplishments you've made, your skills, your strengths, bump up your value. And when you start to see your Fehu shift, it becomes reflected in the world around you. People treat you differently. Things are attracted to you in a different way. So by changing your inner runes, you change the world around you. And that was basically the basis of my book, Runes for Transformation,
Mm,
is to see the runes in the world around you. You know, Fehu for its value, Urus for the strengths, Thurzas for the hostilities that are present, Anzus for the wisdom that's out there. All of these kind of things. I have you take a look at that and then turn those runes internally. Like, what is your Fehu, your value, Urus? What is your strength? Thurzas, what gets you upset? What gets you assertive, if not aggressive, or whatever? Anzus, how do you learn best? How do you best speak? So it's
mm,
taking that stock of your inner world and then causing that shift to an intentional way so that the world around you becomes a reflection. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of the Norse tradition and runes.
mm-hmm. Mm. No, that's very interesting. And so what I'm hearing is like it's a tool. It can be a tool to utilize more of discovering who you really are and who you intentionally really want to be rather than kind of going by default.
Exactly. Exactly. It's taking intentional stock of who you are and making the shift that you want. Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very interesting. I've seen, as you know, I've met you a few years ago, and then even more so now, I've seen more mention of runes and more spiritual type places or more online postings and reels, which I found very interesting, which has definitely made me more curious about it as well as, again, like you're saying, a tool to discover, connect, a means of that. So with that, you know so much about Norse and runes and all these things that you've utilized yourself. How did that begin? Like, let's go back to when you were obviously younger. How did that all begin with that journey to where you are now?
Got a very interesting multiple phase journey. I shouldn't say that about myself. I had a very interesting life. No.
I think we've had all many interesting
Yes.
phases, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Now, I tend to say that I grew up in the paranormal world. I mean, literally born into it. And I'll start with the paranormal and I'll move to the Norse stuff because that became the means for me to help kind of get a beat on things.
Hmm.
And when I say born into the paranormal, I mean quite literally born into it. My mom's OBGYN when she was pregnant with me was Dr. Robert Bradley, who's one of the inventors of the Bradley natural childbirth method. But he also had seances regularly at his home.
Interesting.
And he regularly gave lectures at the spiritualist church that we went to, which is like your normal Protestant church, but they end services with trance mediumship. Like 1 to 3 mediums would come up on stage and do some trance channeling. And then every Saturday night in the church basement were seances. So I
Mm,
got to learn how to do seances from a very young age. And another interesting thing about Dr. Robert Bradley is some of his encounters, some of his experiences were put together in a movie called The Changeling, starring George C. Scott. Came out back, I think, in 1980.
okay.
So literally, I was born into the paranormal.
Uh-huh.
And the house I grew up in was, of course, it was haunted. I think that's probably why my parents went to the spiritualist church to try to better understand what was going on in the house. Because you would hear footsteps going up and down the hallway. You couldn't see anybody there. Back in the old days when you had the dial, a physical dial on the TV where you had to get up and change the channel, I
I
remember being
remember.
a kid and I'm like, Dad, can we get a TV with a remote? And he's like, Well, I got a good remote. You. I'm like, oh, now get up there and change the channel. Yeah.
A classic
But
dad line.
yes. But you'd be watching TV and literally that dial would turn.
Oh,
I mean, it
wow.
would physically turn while you're watching it. So at first it was a little startling, but get to the point where it's just like you roll your eyes and like, oh, okay, fine, whatever. Then you turn it back. I remember one time coming upstairs. My room was in the basement where all the books were. But I remember coming up one night in the middle of the night, kind of like a midnight snack, and all the radios just turned on upstairs.
Mm.
I wasn't near them anywhere. It's just like, come on. My mom collected music boxes and You can understand like maybe one or two music boxes here or there might just turn on their own spontaneously, like the switch gets flipped or whatever. But there's been a couple times where all of the music boxes would go off. They would just
Yeah.
turn on all simultaneously.
And how
So
did you feel about that though? Because it seems like it kind of seemed more annoying than anything, is how you're describing it.
sometimes it was, I would come home from school, set my coat and a bag on the bed, turn around and do something, then go back to try to go hang up my coat and it's gone.
Oh, wow.
That's happened. And then it would show up in another part of the basement. I'm like, I wasn't even in that room today. Like what? So it got a little mischievous, a little bit playful. Now, at first it was scary as hell because TV and movies, When I was 7 years old, I went to my grandmother's house with my sister and we stayed there for a few nights. My parents finally got a like romantic time together. It's cool now, when I think about it as an adult, it's cool that they got to do that. But at 7 years old, I'm like, what? So it was like the first and only time I stayed overnight at my grandmother's house. And it was back in the days when HBO was like a satellite dish on the roof, like
Hmm.
even before cable TV. I'm
Hmm.
dating myself here, if that's okay.
I remember, so I'm there with you.
And my sister, who is 7 years older than I am, I'm the youngest of the family, but she wanted to watch The Exorcist. And my grandma's like, okay. So here I am, 7 years old in an unfamiliar house watching The Exorcist.
Yeah.
It scared the hell out of me. I was literally a zombie for 2 days. Well, literally, but I was a zombie for 2 days, just walking around until my parents showed up, and then that kind of snapped me out of it. But the benefit to that is I remember the girl got possessed. Reagan got possessed when she was in her room sleeping on her back. And so when I would go to bed, I made sure I was aware of my level of consciousness. I was step by step progressing into a sleep state. I learned how to kind of set up some protection eventually. But that's also when I learned how to really communicate with what I call the whisperers, my
Mm.
guides, the teachers that have been with me my whole life, because it helped me to discern what were my thoughts versus what I was receiving. So I could
Mm.
tell it's like, oh no, that's not my thought. That's not my emotion. Where's that coming from? Who's that coming from? What are they saying? So I could be discerning. And I learned that at a very, very young age. Now that's where things got a little bit weird because I'm experiencing the paranormal and nothing scary is going on. I mean, it's annoying. Things get moved around, you hear footsteps. It's a little annoying, sure. But then I'm seeing the TV shows, I'm seeing the movies, all of the
Hmm.
media, and they're portraying demonic, hellish scenes. The Amityville Horror House scared the hell out of me as a kid. The whole series of those movies.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was trying to reconcile what I was seeing in the movies, which were believable, especially when you're a gullible child. Those are
Of course.
believable. I'm reconciling what I'm seeing in the media versus what I'm experiencing.
Hmm.
They are two vastly different worlds. I mean, completely different worlds. To the point now, after doing this for decades and working with the paranormal for decades, I realized that a very typical seance, a very typical paranormal encounter, it's too boring for a movie. Nobody would make a movie out of it. I've actually had some people complain. It's like, well, it's just like people are sitting around just quiet and breathing. And I'm like, yeah, because it's your inner world that's getting the transformation. You're making this connection. So, because the movies and the TV shows have basically pre-programmed us to expect a book flying across the room, a pounding on the wall,
Right.
disembodied voices. When in reality, it's more like just a knowing. You get this sense of knowing. You have an idea. You have a fond memory of grandma just suddenly pops up and you feel close to her and you're like, wow, that was great. That's a paranormal experience. They're that
Hmm.
subtle. There are times I work with clients and students. They're expecting communication to be this overt voice saying, you need to go here and do that, and you must be working on that. Instead, they're trying to reconcile what it feels like. Well, I have this kind of like this idea to do something, and I really want to feel like I'm going to do that. I'm like, yes, that's the communication. That's what it's
That's what
like.
you're looking for. Yeah.
Exactly. It's that subtle. And so I've been spending quite a few years, teaching seance, teaching communication techniques, helping people to awaken their abilities. And that's somewhere somewhat of the shadow work comes in because I had to do my own shadow work
Hmm.
because seeing The Exorcist, seeing those horror movies, had to reconcile. Oh, this is just the media telling a fictional story that's going to capture our attention. So I
Mm.
had to kind of diffuse those fears. For example, because of The Exorcist, I would have a recurring nightmare that I'm dealing with somebody who's possessed, like the whole flopping around in bed, cussing, puking, being just overly dramatic, and not knowing what to do about it. And
Mm-hmm.
then as time progressed and I worked through that and I understood more of the origin of the demons and demonology and understood where that came from and realized it's just a twist. It's just all messed up because demons aren't demons. They're just gods from previous religions. That's all they ever were. And when I realized that, those dreams completely stopped. And I'm like, oh. And I took courses on spirit release work, and I saw what depossession was really like. Not exorcism, anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. And I'm just like, oh, this is all it ever really was. That's all it ever meant to be. And it's just like all of a sudden those fears, all of that stuff that I saw at the movies, just I don't need to reconcile it anymore. That's just fun. And they're
Just
fun to watch. I still watch them.
they just fell
But
away though.
no bearing on reality whatsoever. And so that's kind of a big part of my work is to let people know the stuff they see in the movies is not real. And I've got my soapbox. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going on here,
That's
but
okay.
I've got my soapbox of Ed and Lorraine Warren. I'm really grateful that they brought the paranormal to the mainstream, that they help people see that the paranormal is a real thing. The only problem is they're demonologists
Okay.
and they worked with the Catholic Church. So every haunting they went to, every paranormal situation to them was a demon,
Uh-huh.
even if it wasn't.
Right. Because they were
And
like creating that of that's what they believed it to be, and so that's the experience they're going to create.
exactly, exactly. Every paranormal experience is co-created. And they came into some houses where people weren't having problems. It was just an annoyance. It was like what I talked about with my growing up. It
Mm-hmm.
was just an annoyance, and they were trying to get some understanding. And Ed and Lorraine kind of barged in and like, "Well, there's a demon trying to take over." And they would do a séance, and it would just erupt into just chaos and a nightmare situation when it
Mm,
didn't have to be. And
I
so
see.
that's unfortunately bit of their lingering legacy is people still go, "Well, that's not really grandma coming to visit you. It's a demon in disguise trying to steal your soul." So we're still combating a lot of this fear.
Kind of like old way of thinking that it's all there to hurt you, not help you.
Exactly. And we just coexist with each other. We're
Mm-hmm.
just neighbors with each other. That's all. And we can get along with our neighbors or we can have problems with our neighbors. And if we have problems with our neighbors, they're going to have problems with us.
That's very
So
true.
why can't we just get along?
Yeah. Classic line. Why can't we just get along? It would be so easy.
Exactly.
Well, it sounds so interesting, kind of that journey of like, even when you were saying about the horror movies and whatnot, that it was almost like you kind of were taking your power back, was how it resonates to me, and that you realized you were just buying into like fear-based thinking and fear-based thoughts of like, those are correlating to the movies you were seeing. And then once you realize that's not really the case and that's not really what's going on, it was like then those nightmares or whatever you were saying kind of just dissipated and went away. It was like they had no hold over you anymore.
Exactly. And that's what we do with shadow work. Is it's just getting to understand where your fear comes, where your agitation comes from, where those negative emotions, it's just learning about them. Like, what are they trying to say? Where did they come from? What are they doing? And when you have that understanding of what the shadows are, that tends to take away their energy.
Mm,
But if we resist them, if we push them down, and like, no, I don't want to think about this. No, I don't want to feel this. No, I don't want to deal with that. You push it down, they will find a way to come up and they get worse. So if you're feeling afraid of the paranormal, okay, fine, acknowledge that, accept that that fear is there. Try to understand where it came from. Like, okay, because mom and dad always said this and always said that, and they were trying to protect me, and that they don't know. They don't really have experience. That diffuses some of it. And then experience some of the paranormal. Learn how to do some of the techniques, like the stuff I teach people how to set sacred space, how to open portals to connect and communicate, which leads to one of my rules. I've got like 10 rules of interacting with the paranormal. And one of
yeah.
them is the more you interact with the paranormal, the safer it gets. Because the more you're interacting with it, you see what it really is like. You see what really happens, and it diffuses the fear automatically through
Mm,
direct experience. It just goes away. And because similarities attract and perpetuate, that's my main rule. You're no longer projecting this fear. You're no longer having this fear energy out there. So you're not going to draw to you any fear-based entity or anything that will feed off of it because your fear is gone. So the more you interact with the paranormal, the more you experience it, it just gets safer and safer. Not, which is completely the opposite what we hear from like church
Right.
leaders and fear
It's
mongers.
run away from it, avoid it, don't make contact. Um, so it's very interesting as you were talking too of like when I grew up as well, like I remember hearing footsteps and like cabinets closing and different things at night, and I always felt like I was being watched. I had a very high sensation of feeling that I was being watched all the time. I would wake up in the middle of the night and I just felt like a presence there. And like I didn't really know what was going on other than I just thought I was a scared kid, and it's an older house and it was sometimes made weird noises. But there wasn't really anything that ever scared me, or stuff didn't get moved around. But it seemed to be, even as I got older, there would be different places I've lived, and then I would come home and all the radio was on that I totally forgot about until you just said it. And I was like, oh my gosh, that did happen. And that happened a few times. So it's interesting to hear of just like when that stuff happens, what are you saying or what has been your experience around that? Is it just somebody's trying to communicate with you or it's what is your take on that?
It's been various things. It's been sometimes it's spirits who are lingering around from a previous era that are confused and curious about some of our technology. You know, like people who never had a flushing toilet will, when they get around a flushing toilet, they're like, "Ooh, what's that?" You know,
Just
they see
curious.
us, right? They see us push a button on a radio to turn it on, and they're like, "What's that?" So sometimes it's curiosity. People are people. So, you know, if somebody was a prankster, someone's a little bit tricksy in life, they get to the afterlife, they're going to have fun. They're just going to
Hmm.
have a lot of fun. They're not being malevolent. They're not being evil or trying to be scary. They're just like, ooh, look at this. And these tricksy sort of people, these pranksters, if you do call a priest and you try to do an exorcism on them, of course it's not going to work, but they think it's hilarious. They're like, "Oh, you think I'm a demon?" And so they're going to actually up the ante a little bit. They're going to go a little bit wonky with that. And sometimes it's actually nature spirits and house spirits. They've been with us in every
Interesting.
folk tradition around the world, and they like to be appeased. They like to have a little altar. They like to have their little trinkety stuff. They like to have their fun stuff. And if they ever feel neglected or, you know, even abused or misused or anything, they'll mess with your stuff. And they
Mm,
can be playful too. So they're the ones that will move your keys around. They'll put,
mm,
they'll steal shiny things. They'll kind of mess with things. So over the years, it's been my experience that it's been all sorts of things. And there's even one kind that kind of gets a little bit blown out of proportion on
hmm.
purpose. And that's what I call the poltergeist effect. Now, the poltergeist effect does not mean that there necessarily is a spirit in the house or any sort of entity in any way. What the poltergeist effect is somebody in the house has very sensitive emotions. They're very volatile internally, but they can't express it for whatever reason. They can't release that energy. They can't express their emotion. A lot of times this is an adolescent. You know, with adolescents, they've got their raging hormones, their raging emotions, and mom and dad are just like, "Oh, just go to your room. I'm sick of hearing about it. Just shut up." Now,
Right.
maybe this person may have had a real paranormal experience. You know, maybe there's just a kid walking through the room or something. I don't know. But then they start to get this fear. They start going to mom and dad's, "Oh, just stop it. Stop. I don't want to hear your imagination, your imaginary friends, blah, blah. Just go away." Now, this is all raging inside. So, what do? Well, that will manifest as things moving around, people getting scratched, weird little problems in the house. And as soon
Interesting.
as this person finds a way to safely express their emotion, that telekinetic energy drops and the paranormal effect goes away. So there are multiple causes for all of these things happening.
That's really interesting. So it's almost like it's just manifesting outside is what you're saying of like really more of the emotion that's happening inside.
Exactly.
Very
Exactly.
interesting. I heard imaginary friends in there. So like I did have an imaginary friend growing up. I don't think I've really talked about that on the show yet, but I vividly remember having one for quite a long time. like at least until I was 5 or 6, at least. And she was always around a lot, always had her beautiful white horse with her. And so, in those experiences, because there's a lot of people I think that I have spoken with that do have had imaginary friends, they really didn't talk about it or they've forgotten. I think that's often the case too. They kind of forgot that that was there. But in my case, mine, my imaginary friend's name was Mimi. And I didn't put it together until later that it was like me visiting me, is how it kind of came through as a message. So, what has been your experience with imaginary friends? Is it really me visiting me from another time or
That
whatever?
brings that brings up two very interesting things. We all have natural paranormal abilities.
hmm That's a
Every
great
single one
point
of
to bring
us.
up.
Yeah, we all have clairvoyance. We all have clairaudience. We've got clairsentient. We all do. It's
hmm
natural. We're born with them. But because as kids, we mimic the parents and the people around us. That's how we learn to walk. That's how we learn speech, is by mimicking the people around us. But the people around us aren't talking to the spirits we're seeing. They're not interacting with the energies we're feeling. In fact, they'll tell us, no, that's not real. That's your imaginary friend. I don't want to hear these imagination games. And they convince us it's just something we've made up completely. And so
hmm
as we grow up and we're emulating the people around us, we turn off our abilities. We've
hmm
convinced ourselves it was a purely imaginary friend. There's nobody there.
Right.
And as adults, we think we lose that ability. I want to say it that way. We think we lose that ability because we haven't used it. But the funny thing is it's still there. And it always nags us. There's a certain point in life when you get settled, things are kind of calm, then that nagging comes back. It's like, remember you were connected with an imaginary friend at this age? Remember what she was like? Remember what was going on? And you start getting these little hints at your abilities coming back online. And that's where it's great to get some training. Get some training to
hmm
how to use them, how to interpret that information coming through, to get a better understanding of what it's really like. When you have incoming messages, there's not suddenly going to be a wind blowing your hair and you have to hold your temple.
Yeah, very much the TV show type. Yes,
Yes,
I
the
I
wind
know the
isn't going
message now.
exactly. And so when we reset those expectations, then people's abilities come back online. Now, the other part that you said, I love it. I love that, especially that you called her Mimi. That's beautiful.
Uh-huh.
Because imagine this. Well, before we do imagine this, the thing to keep in mind is in the spirit world, time doesn't work like it does here. There is no sense of time. There's no past, present, future. There's just resonance. And then you can tune into different resonance as to a location. And you move at the speed of thought, which is even faster than light because everything is consciousness. But because there is no time, you can experience any place, anytime, anywhere, anyhow. And this is what I've been taught is what we can call an alpha and omega point. An alpha point is a time period when you were awakened, that you were much more than just a physical, mundane person. It could have been in childhood, could be adulthood, doesn't matter. You had this awakening point. And after you had that awakening point, there was somebody there kind of teaching you, kind of guiding you, kind of nudging you and poking you
Mm.
until you get to the omega point. For a lot of people, the omega point doesn't happen until after the death of the body, but for some, it happens before. And this is where you start to realize that that person that woke you up, that guided you through that entire time, was actually yourself. That higher self, that higher version of yourself, that is the result of the spiritual work that you've been doing, which is the omega point when you merge, when you become. And this is when people hit that omega point when they're in life. They're like, I used to have a higher self. I used to have a teacher, but now they seem to be gone. I'm like, no, they integrated with you. You're now caught up to yourself.
Oh, that's very interesting.
And so it's like your future self went back in time, woke up your younger self, said, hey, and then is teaching you and has a vested interest in your growth because your growth and your work is what gets them to that omega point. So, of course, they want you to be doing the spiritual work. So, yes, very likely your imaginary friend was
Was
you
me. Uh-huh.
waking you up. That could have been your alpha point saying, hey, you're much more than this. You have these abilities, you have these talents, and she's there kind of guiding you along the way, saying, do this, do that, practice this, look at that.
That is super interesting. And I've never heard it explained like that. So, I mean, what you're sharing, it's like I feel it in my my senses right now that that like really resonates. And so then if there's no time, like you were sharing, which is, hard to logically think through, but and that's the point. You're not supposed to logically think through it, but um so you could literally be like, that's a version of me visiting the little me, and then me now could go back and visit me too. And you could have all these different me's trying to teach yourself or communicate whatever it may be that they're trying to get across that that point in time needs to know.
Absolutely.
That's cool. That's
Isn't
like
it?
the Spider-Verse, Marvel, all the
Yep.
movies that are happening now that are at least trying to put this more into a context we can understand it in. Everything Everywhere
Absolutely.
All at Once. That's one of my favorite movies.
That was a fun movie.
Really fun. Really fun. Well, cool. I learned something new about my imaginary friend. Thank you.
But
So
go ahead. Yeah.
you you got to where you were saying like from a young age you were very already kind of born into this. You said paranormal, but you had a environment that sounds like it was cultivating of that. Which wasn't adding to more of the fear-based agenda or, like, hey, Drake, don't do this, don't explore this. It was more of an encouragement, would you say?
Absolutely. That's one of the cool things about my parents is they aren't, I don't have the typical story of I was connecting with spirits. I was talking to spirits. Mom and dad told me it was evil. I was curious in paganism. Mom and dad told me it was evil. I didn't have any of that. My parents took me to that spiritualist church. I went to the services. I went to the seances. As I started to explore alternate paths of spirituality, because Christianity just wasn't working for me. My mom worked near Isis bookstore down in Denver, and she had no problem picking up a book for me or getting me incense or herbs or anything that I needed to do to explore different paths. And no, it was really encouraged. There was even a time when she connected me with like a Wiccan high priestess in Denver. And that's when I realized Wicca really wasn't a path for me. I kind of gave it a good explore, looked into it, but I'm like, no, that wasn't for me. But what was working for me at that time was like runes and the Norse work and the stuff that was all associated with that Scandinavian area. And all of that came born out of reading Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. That
Ooh.
was one of the books in my parents' basement. Of course, my room was in the basement, and the basement was wall to wall bookshelves, like 2 layers deep of books. There was just a ridiculous amount of books. And I was allowed to read everything. And when I came across Secret Teachings of All Ages, it's like this big, thick, tome-sized book where Manly P. Hall talks about the mystery teachings of different mystery schools from way back in ancient Egypt to the Rosicrucians, the Masons. He mentions the Brotherhood of Odin in there. And it struck me that all of these different mystery schools were saying the same thing about how consciousness interfaces with universe and reality, but they use different terms and symbols and different means of reaching the same state. So I said, I need a single path. And that's where I chose the Norse path because it was making more sense to me. The runes resonated with me, and I dove deep into the Norse. I can read Old Norse, I can do my own translations of Old Norse.
Oh,
Like I said,
wow.
got way deep into it and started to see the practical application. That's the key part about the Norse is the Norse people didn't live a separate spiritual and physical life. They didn't go to like church and do whatever they do at church and then go back. It was all integrated.
Hmm.
So the work that they did at the spiritual level had to have a practical application in their daily life. It was their survival. It was a very different world. So all of their spiritual techniques, they're interacting with the natural world. The use of the runes was dependent on the survival of their community. And had to look at that the same way. Okay, what were they doing? How did it practically apply to their world? How do we practically apply it in our world today if we're going to be studying that? And that's
Right.
the path I took. My parents fully supporting of that, letting me have any book, letting me explore, teach, do anything I need to learn. So yeah, my parents were super supportive in this alternative path that I was on.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm sure that, I mean, that was just part of your journey. That was meant to be that way to be helpful for you. And I love what you said in there too of like the practical application of it. I think that's where it's very and I suppose sometimes too, it's just different phases we're going through, but you can get really into something or really curious about it. And then if it's not really being applied, then it's not really serving you or your life that you're living now. It's kind of, again, could be going on default a little bit, getting caught up in the um just learning, constant learning. I know I've done that. I
Exactly.
really like to go down the rabbit hole and then maybe it's not being applied in any which way or how. So,
Exactly. I've actually had a number of clients over the years that they're looking for some practical help with their spirituality because things in the daily life aren't working out, relationships, career, money, all of those kind of things, the big important stuff. It's just not working out and they don't understand it. They're like, but I'm on this spiritual path and I've read this and I've read that and I've read this and I've read that and this and that and this. And they give me this litany of books they've read. I'm like, great, but what are you doing? And they're like, I don't know where to begin. I don't know where to start. And I'm like, well, that's why.
yeah. It almost reminds me of that show, Say Yes to the Dress. It's totally off topic, but in that show, the people that had seen 50 to 100 dresses couldn't make a decision. They got so overwhelmed with all the options that it almost became like overload and then didn't know which one to pick, even though there was, obviously great options. But the ones that are like in that 10 range, they make a choice and, move on. So it's almost like information overload.
Exactly. Too much information can actually paralyze us. I mean, it's a good thing. I do encourage reading, but when these people have had that overload where they don't know what to do, where to go, I'm like, okay, stop. One book. Which one book resonated the most with you?
Oh, that's a good
And then just
question.
work through the practices, do the practices. There's a saying that I really like as the map is not the territory.
Yes.
Meaning you could read the books, but until you actually explore the work and you do the work, you have no idea what those, because the words on the page are a very poor metaphor for what the real experience is like.
Right.
We don't have words that can convey what the experience is like and what that work is like. And you can only do it by starting to do what's written down or what I teach people to do. And then when you have the experience, it's like, oh, and then that's where the transformation happens.
Yeah, oh, right. But yeah, just reminds me of like the riding the bike and different things like that. Like you could watch somebody ride the bike, you could read about somebody riding a bike, you could watch a video on somebody riding the bike, but until you actually do it yourself, you haven't had the full experience of what it's like to ride a bike. So,
I like that exactly because you won't know exactly how the body needs to move and what that automatic balancing is. You're right. Exactly. I like that.
yeah, I like analogies. If I can think of them or remember them. So with your upbringing, when did you really decide to get into this work of helping other people and supporting other people in their own journey? How did that come about?
It was just a natural progression. I'm a natural born teacher. That's my purpose in life. And I've kind of learned that the hard way a couple times. But I started getting into teaching Norse classes, leading Norse ritual. It started with the whole Norse thing and writing the runes for transformation. It started with the Norse stuff, and I saw how that was working with people. And again, I always approached it not, I'm just not going to teach you just the runes. I'm not going to just teach you this. I want you to have a practical, real world application. And that was one of the conversations I had with the Whisperers. I'm like, great, the information you've been giving me is terrific. This is very interesting, but what do we do with it? How do we use it? And so I had to have this little conversation say, stop giving me stuff unless we can make a practical use out of it. And
Oh,
that
that's
changed.
interesting.
Yeah, it changed everything because that was, I think, the moment I realized that not only did I just want to teach the stuff, but I wanted to help people to help their lives better. And information is useless unless you can use it. And I think that was the moment where I realized, no, this is about helping people.
Could you repeat that one more time? I just think it was so powerful of like you said to them specifically. It was almost like uh you know, stop giving me this information unless you tell me how to use it. Is that what you said?
Basically, yeah, exactly. I mean, the information's great, but what do we do with it?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's so powerful in that way because again, I feel, myself has experienced that, but I can think of many of other people I've chatted with, and it's like that is a missing part, it feels like, right? Because it's like you just can't seem to get the clarity on where you're going to go with it or what's the next step, the action part of it.
Exactly. And that action is so important. Because that action, I mean, we can do a hypnosis, we can do meditation, we can do ceremony and ritual, and they're very powerful. They're very effective. They're kind of like the reset button for our
Mm.
inner world. It's good stuff, but it's when you take action, when you move on that stuff, it actually changes stuff literally physically inside. It will reprogram schemas, our patterning system inside, but it will also change the world around you. So taking action is so critical.
There's almost like a momentum building factor that it's like required. And yeah, yeah, I just um think that's been a big lesson for 2024, at least for me. And now that we're in 2025, what is there something that has really been coming across your path lately of like what is really needed in this new year? What is really coming to the surface the most for 2025?
For 2025, it's embrace your weirdness. I think this is the time for the black sheeps to
Mm.
come forward. You know, I'm working on a program right now. Literally, it's going to be coming out this month in January. It's going to come out in January. It was originally thinking of it as shadow work for the spiritually divergent people who,
Interesting title.
yeah, it's for people who follow divergent paths of the spiritual, or the mainstream just doesn't work. But they're black sheeps. We've been ostracized for it. We've been kicked out, ridiculed, teased, taunted because you see the world a different way, because you
Mhm.
experience things in a completely different way. You're aware of the paranormal. You're aware of the psychic stuff going on. You're aware of all this, but the rest of the world wants you to fit into their comfort zones.
Yeah.
The mainstream is all about comfort zones. The when we think outside of the box, we have to realize there is no box. It's just a big comfy teddy bear that keeps you from expanding and growing. That's all that that's all the box is. And so 2025 is the time period for us to step up, to realize that the mainstream's not going to cater to our comfort zones. But there's enough of us that have been so disenfranchised and so separate that if we start to recognize it's like, oh, you think that way too? Oh, you experience that too? You realize that you're not alone in this world, that we're just kind of been separated and pulled apart. But when we realize that you're not that, you're weird, you're strange, you're freaky. Okay, just embrace it. Fly your freak flag and love it. But when you realize that you're not alone with that, and that's actually your superpower. Think about this: the thing that you were ostracized and teased for when you were younger is actually your superpower. It's
Mm.
the reason why you're here. It's
Mm.
what your purpose is on this planet. And when you get confident and you get competent in using that, it's going to change the world. And so
No, that's beautiful.
2025 is a year for black sheep to just step up and say, okay, mainstream, you've had your fun. Now let's experience something freaky and fun.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. My sister will love that. She's got to listen to this episode, just saying.
I love it.
Um, no, I think that's very exciting, right? That's very exciting that more people are feeling more embracing of that, or it's that time, it feels like, it sounds like, of just embracing more of that weirdness. It's like once you really start to digest what is normal, you start to realize that nothing's normal. Like there is like no such thing as normal. So I love what you're saying. It's like you might as well just embrace um kind of like all that's you've been avoiding, it feels like too, and really just go for it.
That's the shadow work part.
Yeah.
Embrace those deeper, darker places that you were once scared of. And when you realize that there's nothing to fear because it's you, it really is you. And all of those scary things that are inside are actually trying to help you in their own way. If not necessarily being successful at it, but they're trying to help you in their own way. And when you realize it's all you, it always has been, There's nothing to be afraid of. I mean, somebody's whispering here to talk about this also in the form of nightmares. Like, I got maybe somebody who's listening is having a problem with nightmares. Realize that everything in your dream is you. It's just a different part of the mind expressing itself through a symbol. It's everything in the dream is symbolic. Everything in the dream is metaphoric. Everything.
Mm,
And when you realize that even that bad guy chasing you in the dream is still you, that if you can embrace that bad guy chasing you and say, "Hey, why are you chasing me? What are you doing? What's the purpose of all of this?" That
interesting.
fear gets dispelled because you're now understanding what that bad guy is all about, what the purpose is, and what they're trying to say. And suddenly you realize there's nothing to fear because this is just me trying to communicate to me. So, boom, nightmare's gone.
That makes a lot of sense. You were talking earlier about the scary movies, and me personally, I quit watching scary movies because they would mess with my mind so much. Like I couldn't handle it. But all you're saying is just to face, whether in life or in a dream, to face that fear. And if you face it, then you're going to move to the other side of it.
Exactly. And that's the term I love, move to the other side of fear. And the only way to do it is just experience it and understand it. And that's the key. Understand it. You can't push it away. You can't get rid of it. You actually want to sit with it and say, who are you? What are you here? Why are you doing this? Because realize every single fear you have is trying to protect you. So why is it
Interesting.
protecting you?
Right.
It's trying to help you.
Right. It's trying to give you something that you don't understand yet, basically. And
Yeah.
that's very interesting. Huh.
Yeah. And when you embrace it, you say, cool, thank you for protecting me. Why is it important that you're protecting me? What is it about me that needs to be protected?
Mm-hmm.
What is that part that needs that help? And is there a better way to do it? And you realize, oh, cool. We can do
There's another
this.
way.
There is.
There's always another way, just a matter of whether we want to see it or not, whether we're gonna take the time. I mean, that's what I'm hearing is like really just take the time to sit with it and see it and feel it and see what the message is that's trying to come through.
Exactly. I mean, here's an example of how that fear works. We'll go back to like my dream about people being possessed and demons because you like The Exorcist. What's very interesting to know is there weren't really any prescribed symptoms of possession. Yes, the demonologies and the exorcist have their things, people speaking in a language they don't know, having information that they don't know. There are some of that. But the flopping around, cussing, puking, growling, that kind of thing didn't show up until The Exorcist. But
Hmm.
after The Exorcist, there's a lot of deliverance ministers helping out people flopping around, cussing, puking, growling, just like they did in The Exorcist. It was that pervasive of a movie that people thought that's what it looked like when somebody's possessed. When I am working with clients who really are having a dealing with possession, nothing like that. It's usually
Hmm.
a loved one that thinks that they know better for you. That's trying,
Right.
or it's a lost soul that's a little sick and needs help.
Okay.
It's not a demon trying to hurt you. But when we get into what are demons, of course, the word demon comes from Old Greek daemon, which it means higher self.
I did
That's
not
where
know that.
yeah, it's just a higher, when the Romans turned the word genius. Genius is still your higher self. So daemon or genius, higher self. But in the medieval period, any of the books that were written about the metaphysics or the occult in the medieval period are just awful. I think they were just trying to write horror books, basically.
Hmm.
They were just awful horror stories. And so when the Goetia was written down, when the false hierarchy was written down, there were 72 demons that were listed because 72 is a sacred number, 72 names of God. So, of course, there's 72 demons, right?
Hmm.
All of the demons, and I mean all of them, were deities, loved, benevolent deities from Macedonian, Canaan religions, from Babylon, basically the pre Semitic religions. All of those deities were demonized in the medieval era and turned into demons. So it's why you can read these books that say, if you want to learn about science, this is the demon to conjure to learn about science and mathematics and all these things. Oh, but by the way, they conjure these evil things and they do these bad things. Like, wait, what?
Huh.
Just the demonization of these old gods. And if you realize that these demons that are possessing children, so they flop around and cuss and puke, something that's 10,000 years old. It's been around for a long time. It's got better things to do than get inside of a body of a child and flop around and cuss and puke.
Hmm.
It's just not going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
it.
Interesting.
It's not going to happen.
Very
And when I
interesting.
had that realization, it was just like, oh, I moved to the other side of the fear. That's just not how this works. And when I learned how spirit release works, and I'm like, oh, complete fear gone because I moved to the other side of it through direct experience by facing it, trying to understand it. Where did it come from? What's it all about? And what's really going on? And I'm like, oh, okay, we got this.
Well, that's amazing. I think that's really incredible. You've really dedicated your whole life to more of this understanding and learning of it because I think all that you're sharing is it is easily feared. It is easily avoided. It is easily we get these nudges. I love that you said that earlier, that word, those nudges, and then we're choosing whether to listen to them or not, right?
Yep,
So I I would hope, and with the intention of you sharing some of this, is the people that are getting nudges feel safe and secure enough to move forward with it rather than ignoring it even longer. Because it can be quite life transformational in the sense of whatever yourself is trying to show you and get you to move along in your life.
absolutely. Absolutely. And the more you acknowledge and act on that, that's the key part. Acknowledge and act on them. You start to get more of them. You start to recognizing them. It's what I call the believing seeing dynamic. You
Hmm.
believe it a little bit, therefore you see it. And once you
Mm.
see it, that confirms it, so you believe it a little bit more. You believe it a little bit more, you see it even more, which so it becomes this dynamic of basically opening a door ever wider until you get to the point where you've walked through the door and you're like, well, of course this is the way things are.
Hmm.
Where before
It
you were
makes
wondering a question, now it's like, yeah,
it starts to just make more sense. Whatever it is that you're experiencing, whether you study Norse or whatever it is, it's like just something starts to click and resonate. I think the word. But I think that also the word of today was action.
yes.
Well, that's awesome, Kaedrich. Is there any last thoughts you have before we end today?
Ah, remember that the paranormal is it's just like going down to the local park. You know, there are other people there, there are other animals there, and if you are there just respectfully and calmly, you're gonna have a great time. You know, if you're gonna hang out with the squirrels and you watch the squirrels doing their thing, that's cool. But if you're gonna mess with a squirrel, of course you're gonna get bit. It's not that the squirrel's being bad or evil. It's just you are violating its territory and its comfort zone, and it defended itself. So just be respectful, just be calm, and realize that as a person at that park, you are as much as the flora and fauna of that park as everything else is. And that's the way
Mm,
the paranormal works. You are a spiritual and physical being existing in the physical and paranormal. So if you're respecting your physical neighbors and the physical people and animals around you, do the same thing for your spiritual neighbors because they're all the same.
that's beautiful. Very simplistic, great advice
Thank you.
for, yeah. Thank you, Kaedrich, so much for being here. And what's the best way to get in touch with you if people have more questions about all this amazing, interesting stuff, all your knowledge you have about Norse and runes?
My website is kaedrich.com. It's Kaedrich, just kaedrich.com. And I'm on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. If you just search my name is a key that unlocks a lot of doors.
Love it. That's a great line. Well, thank you again for being here. And all that information will definitely go in the podcast uh, link, and you can find Kaedrich there. And thank you so much for listening today. Thank you so much for being here and listening today. I hope you found this episode helpful, interesting, insightful. And with that, to subscribe, a reminder to subscribe to the channel so we can bring you more amazing content, more guests, more inspiration. It is